of solder on my soldering iron and push it on, and then have the solder run all the way down the teeth of my pinion.
I don't know that.
Well, she didn't know that, so maybe you do now. That was a good tip. Hello, welcome to another Clevetech Tech Tips video. Hopefully you've seen some of my other videos, and this one actually follows on from the last video I did. So in the last video you probably saw me run in a JK Hawk Retro motor. So this time we're now going to add a pinion to the motor, fit a pinion and get a decent gear mesh on one of these Genesis chassis. So this chassis here is a standard class we run in the UK. It's called our Intro 32 class. Everyone runs the same chassis, everyone runs the same type of motors, everyone runs the same ratio of gears. There are some choices of body shell, but it's a fairly even class, and it's our beginners class in the UK. Let's start with taking a look at how the motor sits in the chassis and how the shaft length looks compared to our spur gear. So you can see the shaft is too long at the moment, doesn't need to be that long. When the tyre goes on, the tyre is going to come up and it's going to hit the shaft of the motor, so we need to reduce the length of the shaft on the motor. Now I found this is normally on these chassis about just under 7mm or so, but if you're setting this up on a new chassis or want to do it on other chassis, then you might want to take a measurement to get shaft length correct. So I'm going to take my digital calipers, make sure they are zeroed, and then I'm going to check the distance, in this case from the face of the can to the outside edge of the gear. So in this case we're looking at approximately there, if I can hold that at the right angle. See that? That brings it in to approximately the outside edge of the gear. So this is reading 6.72 or 6.73. So I'm going to cut the shaft at around about 7mm long from the end of the can. So let's take that out of the chassis. And then I'm going to mark the shaft where I want to cut it. Like that, using my pen. So I've marked around the shaft, and that's now ready to cut. So to cut the shaft, I'm going to use a cutting tool or a cutting end into a grinding disc in my rotary tool. I'm going to just cover my block because there's going to be some little bits of metal dust. Going to run it at the highest speed possible. Now, sometimes it's also worth covering any holes in the motor to make sure you don't get any dust going actually into the motor, and it helps it stop any dust from sticking to the magnets. So then I'm going to just cut through the shaft, giving it a little bit of a chance to cool in between because I don't want to get it too hot. The length of the shaft at this stage is not so critical, so that's why I've marked it slightly longer than it needed to be. But there we are, I'm now through. It's sensible to wear goggles because at any point the disc could shatter or the part that you're cutting off could fly off into your eyes. So it's definitely worth wearing goggles. So now that's cut through. Hopefully at this stage you won't have too much dust on your motor, but if you do, you can get a piece of blue tack and you can get rid of most of the metal deposits with a piece of blue tack all over your motor like that, and clean that up. Now at this stage the end is probably quite rough and sharp, so I'm going to connect my motor to my power supply, spin it round, turn my cutting disc on again, and I'm just going to clean up the end of the shaft just to get rid of any burrs. Now at this stage I'm not too worried if the end of the shaft is not perfectly square and straight, because it's likely to be too long at this point. So let's move that out of the way, make sure my block is clean again, and now we're ready to put the pinion onto the shaft. Before we go too far, I'm just going to check that this brand new pinion, I think it's an ARP 11 tooth 64 pitch pinion, make sure that fits onto the end of my brand new motor shaft. Yes it does, so it slides on. If it's a bit tight, sometimes some brands of pinion are maybe a little bit too tight on the shaft, some shafts are slightly different sizes, then you can grind the shaft down using a little bit of wet and dry paper while spinning the motor in a power supply, and you can actually reduce the size of the shaft slightly, just so that the pinion slips nicely onto the shaft and there's no wobble. So this just rotates, there is no wobble, it's a lovely fit onto that shaft. That's why I use these pinions, they're really nice pinions. So if you notice, the pinion, actually the teeth on the pinion are quite long. And you can notice actually also that the shaft is plenty long enough for fitting the pinion on. So I'm actually going to compare that to my angled spur gear, but you can see that the pinion is far longer than it needs to be. So actually the pinion could be a good 1.5 mil shorter than it currently is. So I'm going to be cutting that pinion down to make it shorter and lighter. I'm ready to trim down the pinion, but I need to attach it to this old motor shaft first. Now I'm going to solder it onto the end of the motor shaft. The motor shaft is tinned already. Got a little tool here with a little sort of spongy end, so I'm going to dip that into my acid flux, put a little bit of flux around the motor shaft, put the pinion on the end, and I have a preheated soldering iron that's set to a pretty high temperature. A little bit of solder on the tip just to help for heat conduction, and I'm going to heat the pinion, and that heat will then get transmitted into the shaft and the pinion will go onto the shaft. Now I'm not putting the pinion all the way onto the shaft, I'm actually leaving it so that the pinion is only actually just onto the shaft a small amount. So you can see the shaft is actually inside the hole there of the pinion. Okay, I didn't use a lot of flux because I don't want to get any flux down inside the teeth at this stage. I don't want to get it down inside the teeth at any stage, but this stage really I'm only just attaching the pinion enough just to make sure that I've got something to hold the pinion with when I'm cutting it slightly shorter. I'm going to start by just cutting the pinion slightly shorter. I'm not going to be rotating the motor, I'm just literally going to hold it in place and use my grinding disc to cut the pinion slightly shorter. I'm going to be doing this by eye because I've done this many times, but you might want to again make a mark with a pen on the pinion where you're going to cut it down to. I'm going to cover my work area again, run my cutting disc as fast as I can. Now I'm going to use my fingers inside the motor just to hold the armature in place so it doesn't rotate whilst I am cutting. And I'm going to do this carefully because I don't want to overheat the pinion and find that the pinion end comes flying off the shaft. So I'm going to trim it a little bit at a time. Because this is an old motor, it doesn't matter if I get a little bit of dust inside the motor. Notice I'm rotating the motor a little bit at a time. I'm not trying to go through all in one go. I'm rotating it round, cutting the teeth down bit by bit. A little bit of time in between just to allow it to cool. And we're through. Not a particularly nice cut, but I'm going to neaten that up in a minute. So once again, I need to heat up my pinion. I'm going to use a knife just to help lever the pinion off. It shouldn't be tight. We know it went on fairly easily. We know the pinion slips nicely onto the shaft, so we shouldn't need a lot of force to get that off. But that should just come off nice and easily. And I can get rid of my old motor. Now, this motor needs the shaft tinning. But before I do that, I'm just going to clean the shaft up a bit, because often on these motors, there's a bit of a coating of oil or something like that on the shaft that doesn't really take to the solder very well. So I'm just going to very quickly clean the shaft off. So this time, I'm going to be running it at about 5 volts. A little bit of wet and dry. And just clean the shaft up. You'll see it change colour ever so slightly, just as I clean that top surface off of the shaft. This is very fine wet and dry. I think this is around about 800, something like that. Might even be 1000. Just enough just to clean off that top layer. And then I need to tin the shaft. So again, I'm going to use my little applicator with a bit of acid flux. Now, I use Lucky Bob's flux. That's just what I've got here at the moment, but I have used other types. They're available from most of your slot racing suppliers. Again, I don't want to be putting loads of solder onto the shaft, so I'm just generally wiping the end of my iron clean. My iron is set to quite a high temperature. And then literally, I can just apply a little bit of solder around the shaft, and the solder should take to the shaft nicely. Apply a little bit more flux again. Now, some people will put a washer on the shaft to avoid getting any flux into the bearing. That's a sensible thing to do. Because I'm not overdoing it with the flux, because I'm only using this little tiny applicator here, I'm not too worried about getting too much flux in there. Again, I'm using a tiny amount of solder, so I'm not too worried about the solder running down the shaft. I'm only putting the solder onto the end of the shaft. So run that on the shaft around there until I'm happy that the shaft is coated all the way round. I haven't gone right up to the bushing. I've left a little bit of clear space there. Then I can make sure any flux there is just wiped off for now. Now the motor shaft is tinned, we're going to fit our pinion in place. Just squishes the solder a little bit and holds it in place. A little bit of flux on the shaft, a little bit of flux down inside the hole. And then this little tip helps you reduce getting solder all along your teeth. Now, some people might use something like an armature die, or they might colour the teeth in with a pen, maybe a permanent pen, something like that. That helps to stop solder from running down the teeth of the pinion. But I'm going to use this little technique. So I'm going to use my knife to put a little bit of pressure on the pinion. I'm going to heat the shaft behind the pinion, and then the pinion should go onto the shaft like so. So I haven't had to put a great big blob of solder on my soldering iron and push it on and then have the solder run all the way down the teeth of my pinion.
I don't know that.
Well, she didn't know that, so maybe you do now. That was a good tip. Let's finish the job by getting the pinion in the right place. So a little bit more flux, a little bit of flux inside the hole again. Now I'm not going to apply any more solder on my iron, but I'm just going to apply a bit more heat to the end of my pinion. Push my pinion on. That's as far on as it will go, level with the end of the motor shaft. I'm going to then take the pinion back off, but not all the way. Just going to slide it slightly further out again, because I just want to make sure that the inside of my pinion is tinned nicely. So I'm going to again apply a bit more flux inside the hole on that pinion. Heat the shaft. Push the pinion on all the way down. I just tend to spin the pinion as well to make sure it's fully coated down onto the shaft. There's probably a bit of solder at the end here. You might even have a little bit of solder sitting in the shaft where you've sort of pushed the pinion on. But now we're going to check the position of the pinion. I've just let that pinion cool down a little bit because I don't want to melt my spur gear. So I'm going to sit the motor in the chassis, and let's have a look at how it lines up with my spur gear. Let's have a look. So my shaft cutting was pretty accurate. In fact, you can probably see actually that I put the pinion on a fraction further down the shaft. So I'm going to clean up this end and clean up that shaft. I'm going to clean up all the solder that's sitting around the edges of the pinion just to make a nice neat job. But I think that sits nicely. If it didn't sit nicely, I could obviously heat the pinion up again and move it one way or the other to get it to sit in the right place for my spur gear. I don't really want to be using washers behind my spur gear, because if ever I have to replace a gear in a hurry, then I've got to worry about all these extra spacers and washers that I've got in there. So ideally, I like to have my spur gear running right up against that oil light or that bearing in place there with no washers in between. So I'm just going to clean up, like I said before, both sides of this pinion now to make a nice neat job. And I'm going to spin up the motor. And because the shaft was just a fraction too long, I'm just going to skim off the end of the shaft with my rotary tool again. It's only a tiny amount to take off, so it shouldn't make a lot of mess. Clean up that face until I get down to the face of the pinion. And whilst the motor's still spinning, I'm going to use my knife, and I'm just going to run my knife into here and just clean up any solder, there we go, that's sitting on the shaft at the end there. So any blobs of solder have gone. You could also do the same on the front face of the pinion, like so. Just clean up the front face of the pinion, making sure again there's no blobs of solder. Let's have a look. So we've got a nice finish there. We've got, rotate that round, no blobs of solder there. We've got nothing down the teeth, but I might have some little burrs on the edge of my pinion. So to clean them off, I'm going to use a little wire brush, and I'm just going to brush that around the teeth on the pinion. Quite a bit of brushing. It just helps clean off any burrs that are on the edge. If you do happen to get a little tiny bit of solder in the tooth, then a nice sharp knife, and you can run it down the teeth and just make sure that you've cleaned out the teeth if you've got a tiny bit of solder down the end. I mean, this one looks fine, but as I say, some people colour the teeth in. They might use some armature dye, they might use a thick marker or something like that just to stop any solder from sticking to the teeth. Just going to carry on cleaning that up. There we go. Maybe use a bit of blue tack, make sure there's no filings or deposits left stuck to the magnets on the motor. There we go. And then at this point, I'm going to give the motor a good wash because I might have got some flux on my fingers. I might very well have got some flux on the can. Some flux may very well have run down into the bushing. I don't want anything to rust away. I don't want my shaft to rust away. I don't want my pinion to rust away. I don't want any flux to corrode anything. So I'm going to give my hands a good wash, and I'm going to give the motor a good wash. So we're back. I'm even going to give my block a good wipe down, just again with a damp cloth, just to get rid of any flux that may have ended up on the block. Give it a wipe, dry it off. There we go. After everything's had a nice clean, it's now time to check the fitment of the pinion and the spur gear and make sure we get a decent gear mesh. Now with these chassis, we're not allowed to solder the motor into the chassis. It has to be screwed into the chassis. So there's a couple of alignment holes there. This one fits in place with a 1.5mm headed Allen screws. I'm only just going to put one screw in for now, just to check that it all lines up. Put my spur gear. Again, we have to use standard gearing. So this in this case is a 37 tooth. I think this is an S&K. You can get Cahosa 37 tooth angle gears. So let's attach that. Put a little bit of oil on my bushes and a minuscule amount on the M-bell bushing. Not too much, because again, you don't want to contaminate that com or those brushes. Just turn it over by hand, get a feeling for whether the gear mesh is okay. Now this is a slightly used gear. It's got a tiny bit of backlash, but that's perfectly acceptable. Let's have a closer look. Let's have a look at how it lines up with the pinion. That's a nice job. The motor's got a little bit of M float in it, but not much, but it still stays in contact with that spur gear, even on the two positions that the motor could end float into. Thank you for watching another installment of CleveTech Tech Tips videos. That's probably about the third or fourth time I've tried to say that and got it right this time. Hopefully the techniques that you've seen here will be useful to you for fixing pinions to motor shafts. You can obviously use that for other types of motors and other types of pinions. Sometimes motors have ground down shafts. Again, you can use the same technique for those. So please like this video, please subscribe, please comment. If there's anything else you want me to cover, there's plenty more to come. Thank you for watching. Job's a good 'un.